Shaun. I'm an associate professor of transportation engineering at UVU, and I would like to welcome you all to our last panel for today, focusing on ground transportation. So today we have 5 great presentations from different stakeholders, 2 presentations from UTA, Mary DeLoretto and Hal Johnson. We have 1 presentation from UDOT, Blaine, Leonard, and then we have 1 presentation from WFRC, Ted Knowlton, and 1 presentation from MAC, Shaun Seager. Please welcome our first presenter, Mac DeLoretto.
Good afternoon. I'm Mary DeLoretto. I am right now the interim executive director at UTA. Our executive director, Carolyn Gannott, last Friday was her last day, and I'm filling in until we have a permanent director. In the audience, we have our trustee, Jeff Acerson, who represent Utah County. So, Jeff, I saw you up there. You are there. I've been with UTA for 15 years in various roles. My current role, when I'm not interim, is the Chief Service Development Officer, and that role is over capital development, capital construction, our transit-oriented development, and our project controls. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about the legislative funding that we got this year, unprecedented amount of funding to do capital projects, and also I'm going to touch on some Utah County planning projects at the end. As you all know, traffic congestion is just getting worse along the Wasatch Front, and transit is one of the solutions to the mobility issues that we're facing, and I think the legislature recognizes this, and that's why we received about $330 million worth of funding this year for transit projects. So the projects that they are funding, they give us $300 million for double tracking strategic sections of the Frontrunner commuter rail system, $1.6 million for a new rail station in the city of Vineyard along our commuter rail line, $12 million for construction improvements to the streetcar line, the S line we call it, in Sugar House, $11 million for a bus rapid transit project in Salt Lake County. It's called the Mid-Valley BRT, which goes through Murray, Taylorsville, and West Valley City. $5 million for an environmental study at the point of the mountain, and then $4 million for a UTA, for a Sharp-Tintic Railroad consolidation project in Utah County. So I'm going to talk, I have 1 slide on each of these projects that I'll introduce you to. So for Frontrunner, we have 90 miles of Frontrunner from Ogden to Provo, commuter rail, and it runs, at peak, it runs 30 minutes, and during the rest of the day, it runs about an hour frequency. Folks would really like to see that frequency increase, and they'd like to see maybe faster speeds on that. We're limited, though, because of that 90 miles, only 20 miles is double track. So we have to have passing sidings, we have to wait for other trains. So with the $300 million that the legislature gave us, we are going to look at where we can optimize, where we could put additional double track to be able to go faster, have more frequent services. So the activities that we're starting this year, we're performing modeling and operations simulation to see where those double tracking areas can be to get us quick wins, to get us quickly be able to start doing some more frequent service. We hired a operations modeling firm, and they've already identified 5 key areas where they think would really help us achieve some of those goals. We've also hired a program management team to assist with the conceptual design, identifying costs, looking at the impact analysis, helping us with stakeholder engagement, and to keep that project moving forward. And so once we've identified those areas, we're starting to do the conceptual engineering, and then we're going to start the environmental design on those this year, and hopefully start construction sometime by the end of next year. Another project that the state funded for this one, they gave us $1.6 million this year, but this is for the Vineyard Frontrunner station. So this is a brand new station that had always been anticipated when we developed Front Runner South. We had even what we call wowed the tracks out to allow for a station to be put there. The legislature in 2018 gave us $4 million for that station. But as we started looking at it, we realized, well, in order to be able to use that station and have it operational, we needed another 1.8 miles of double track. So as I mentioned, that's what limits us, is the limited double track. So that 1.8 miles is going to cost us another $10 million. So for $14 million, we thought we would be able to build this project, but with escalation, with procurement, material prices going up, construction labor prices going up, we needed another 1.6 million, and the state funded that this year. So we're really happy about that. We had the groundbreaking in May of this year. We are actively under construction for both the station and the double track, and we anticipate that station opening in December of this year. The next project that they gave us funding for was $12 million to extend the streetcar line in Sugar House. That's up in Salt Lake County. Hopefully you're all familiar with that. That's about a 2-mile line that goes from our north-south line, tracks line, to just outside the heart of Sugar House. So they wanted to be able to get right into the center of Sugar House. So the $12 million will probably get us about a couple blocks to the east. And right now we're doing the different conceptual designs to see where that station should go. We eventually think the line will either turn north or south, or maybe even east, but we don't want to preclude any options. So the design for that station is going to make sure it doesn't preclude any of the future options that we might want to do there. Sorry if I'm talking fast here, but we have a lot of presentations today. The next is the Mid-Valley Connector BRT line. So as you can see this picture, the front runner line runs right down the center. The spine of our system here runs right down the center of this picture. The blue line, our original tracks line, goes from downtown Salt Lake to down to Draper. The red line goes from the University of Utah over to Daybreak. The green line goes from the airport over to West Valley City. And this bus rapid transit line is the yellow line that would connect from our Murray Central Station. So it would touch the blue line, the red line, and the front runner line, and go through Murray, Taylorsville, stopping at the Salt Lake Community College, and then on to the West Valley track station, the end of the line for track station. So we think this is a really, good line. It's going to serve a university, a college, and it's going to serve 2 of our central stations. And we've already gotten $22 million from the state, so this was another $11 million that they gave us this year. And we believe that this will be eligible for federal funding. So we have submitted this project to the FTA for project development, and that gets us in the pipeline for the FTA, the Federal Transit Administration Capital Investment Program. And I believe Hal's going to talk a little bit about that process for getting into the federal pipeline in his presentation. So that project right now the environmental document has been submitted to FTA for review, and we're putting a memorandum of understanding with all our partners to secure all the outside funding other than the federal funding, and then we're going to proceed to try to get that federal funding, and that project hopefully we'll be able to start within the next 2 years. We could start, we will be going out for design later this year, and then hopefully construction within two to 3 years on that. Another project they funded is the Point of the Mountain environmental analysis. So if you're all familiar with the Point of the Mountain area, that's where the prison currently exists, and it's moving, and the state has big development plans for that area. They're calling it the Point, and they want world-class transit to serve that area. So what we are looking at, what has been identified as our preferred alternatives right now, is a bus rapid transit that would go from the Draper Frontrunner station. And as I mentioned, with this double tracking that we're going to be doing for Frontrunner, we're hoping to be able to get to 15-minute headways in peak for Frontrunner. And so that would serve that area well by having a bus rapid transit that would go from the Draper Frontrunner station through the Point, and then over the freeway, and it would connect with an existing railroad line that we have, UTA corridor, what is not being used right now, but we could have our BRT line going down through Lehigh and then possibly over to the Lehigh Frontrunner Station. So that, there's been a lot of transit studies on that now, and the next steps are refining the preferred alternative, beginning the conceptual engineering on that, getting better costs for that, and then doing the environmental analysis. I believe it'll be either an EA or an environmental impact statement. We're not sure what FTA is going to be requiring yet. This is another project down in Utah County. It is, so we own, UTA owns, if you can see on this map, we own the sharp line from the Provo Frontrunner Station all the way down to where it leaves that box there in that figure. And then we own the Tintic line from the top of that box all the way down to Payson. So we've always known if we ever want to get our front runner to go all the way down to Payson, we would have to make a connection between the sharp line and the Tintic line. So that's what you see, that little red line is where we would make the connection. Spanish Fork and Springville City are very excited. If we're able to make this connection, we can eliminate that area where it says Tintic, and that is 5 at-grade crossings of a railroad and a residential street that could be eliminated. Those at-grade crossings can be eliminated. And right now, I drove through the area a few months back, and there's residential neighborhoods now, and there's a train line that goes through it. I think it only goes through maybe a couple times a week, but still it's a train going through. So by making that connection, we could eliminate that, and then we'll have a future connection that we need to get all the way down to Payson. We had $6 million for the project, and we were trying to find another $4 million, and so the legislature funded that. So that's going to be really helpful as we move that project forward. It's currently in the design phase, and then it will go out to bid, and then we'll be able to begin construction after that. 1 minute left. Okay. I'll go real fast here. So those are the projects that the legislature funded. And then I just wanted to touch real quick on some other planning projects that we're doing in Utah County, and we're getting funding through our partners, Mountainland Association of Governments, and the Central Corridor Transit Study, if you've heard of that. It's a BRT line similar to UVX that would go from Provo to Lehigh. It's still in the concepts are being developed for that. It would connect to the point of the mountain at the southern portion of the point of the mountain, and the northern portion of the Central Corridor would be a connection point. It could potentially connect to the new Vineyard Frontrunner Station. And right now we are getting ready to move into the next phase of more detailed alternatives analysis and environmental study. The South Valley Transit Study, that's a study that will look at, as I told you, we're doing that connection for Sharp Tintic. So this would actually be what transit options would we look at going from Provo all the way down to Payson and even farther down to Santa Quin. We're working on the study right now, and we hope to select a locally preferred alternative, both the mode and the route this year. And then the Northwest Utah County Transit Study, that is looking at viable transit improvements for Eagle Mountain and Saratoga Springs for near-term development. And we hope to select transit options this year and identify potential funding sources for that. And I think that was my last one, yep. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary, for sharing these great initiatives by UTA. I believe these will improve the public transportation system and will encourage more people to use the system here in Utah. Our next presenter is Blaine Leonard with UDOT.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here with you today. I want to start with a couple of comments that I didn't plan to say, but were triggered by something that Mary said. Mary made a comment about an unprecedented level of funding this year for UTA. Earlier, before lunch, we had a session where the gentleman from, and I'll get this name wrong, the Government's Office of Economic Development, I know that's what it's not called anymore, talked about what sets Utah apart. Traditionally, transportation funding, and maybe largely from the perspective of UDOT, transportation funding sets Utah apart. We're able to do things here because the legislature and the Salt Lake Chamber of Commerce and other groups believe that transportation is key to economic growth. We're able to do things here that our sister states simply cannot do. And when the funding stream from the federal government breaks down, so do they. And we're able to move ahead. Secondly, Utah is known for its ability to innovate and collaborate. The organizations that do transportation in Utah, the MPOs, UTA, UDOT, and others, local agencies as well, are able to come together and do things that is really unprecedented in many other places. Colleagues from around the country point out to me that our long-range plan, where all of those organizations worked together, for heaven's sakes, to pull that plan together, is really different from what other states are not able to do. As I talk about some of the projects I've worked on with UTA, I have colleagues around the country say, well, how did you get your transit agency to give you the time of day? And I say, well, we work together. It's unprecedented. Utah has that capability, and we have an innovative, forward-thinking, collaborative spirit that makes a difference. And that sort of brings me into some things I wanted to talk about here. I believe that in the big picture, everything about how we move is changing. There are really 6 trends I see in transportation. These trends are a few years old. They started independently. They certainly overlap and influence each other, but they all had separate beginnings. And I'm going to walk through them, and then I'm going to talk about 2 of them in just a little more detail. Demographic shifts. An aging population, a younger population that has different attitudes towards driving and vehicle ownership, et cetera, changes how we move and changes what our options are as we move. Secondly, big data. We have access to data that we've never had before. Some of it, traditionally, transportation agencies have generated and then used their own generated transportation data. Today, we have outside data sources that are just unbelievable. Who would have ever imagined that transportation data could be a tool that has a profit motive that can actually be provided to us, and that's available. In fact, there's so much data today that we spend a fair amount of time trying to figure out which of the data is useful, which of the data is real, because there's data that's not, and how to use it. But it's huge, and it's impacting how we operate as an agency. Mobility as a service, the concept that rather than using some sort of a vehicle, large or small, that you own in some particular instance, you get it on the fly, whether that's ride sharing or a scooter or an on-demand vehicle rental or whatever that is. This whole concept of mobility as a service, if you think back, has only existed for the last 8 or 10 years, right? And it changes how we plan and how we move and how we travel as we move around. Fourth, and I think this one's pretty obvious to everyone, changes in vehicle propulsion. And mostly today we talk about that being electrification, but it's also hydrogen and some other sorts of things. And it's changing a lot. And although the percentage of electric vehicles on the roads today is fairly small, and we have a lot of conversation about charging infrastructure and incentivization of those vehicles and all these other kinds of things, look at what the automakers are doing. Essentially, every OEM has announced significant advancements and plans for electric vehicles in their product line, including things we typically think of as muscle cars and trucks. Right? So it's catching on. It's going to take some time, but it's catching on. Connected vehicles, the ability of vehicles to share information with each other and with the infrastructure. To have information flow between vehicles is an unprecedented change, and it's moving forward. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. And finally, automated vehicles. The concept that the vehicle system, the computer in the cockpit, takes over some or eventually all of the human driving functions, or at least in certain situations, right? So we've got a whole bunch of things happening, and these get interrelated and intertwined and run together, but they're very distinct trends with different purposes and origins. Now I'm going to talk about these last 2 just for a minute. Automated vehicles, the concept of an automated vehicle is that onboard sensors see things around the vehicle and make decisions based on what it sees. And it fuses that data together and says, well, this sensor sees this and this sensor sees that, and what do I believe and what do I do? But the idea is to provide information that the human, who can only see in one direction and has different kinds of perception, can have additional data. And eventually the car, which can see in 360 degrees, can make some decisions on its own. People often ask, well, when is this coming? When are automated vehicles coming? Well, they're here. They're here at some level. And if you've bought a new car in the last 3 or 4 years, you had the option, I don't care if it was an expensive car or a cheap car, you had the option to get some sort of minimal automation feature on that car, adaptive cruise control, for instance. So the car in some cases taking over some function from you, or augmenting driver assist features, we call them, augmenting some of your ability. This is still a driver hands-on, driver eyes-on kind of a system, but it assists the driver. We have systems like the Tesla Autopilot and the GM Super Cruise and a couple of others which go one more step and automate some functions which in some cases allows the driver to take hands off the wheel. Eyes are supposed to still be on the road, but hands off the wheel, at least in some scenarios. We'll get to the point where we have systems that allow the driver to take hands off and eyes off as well. Now this, from a consumer standpoint, isn't really here yet, but that's where we're going in some situations. And there's a variety of places where this will impact us. Automated freight, automated transit, package delivery. And lest you think this is futuristic, because these pictures are futuristic, Neuro and a bunch of other companies are delivering pizzas and groceries to homes in 20 cities around the US today with these automated whatevers, right? These little vehicles that aren't meant to carry you and I, and some are on the sidewalk and some are on the road, and they take different shapes and forms, but it's changing. If you think of how many times the Amazon driver comes to your house and it can be replaced by this, it's transformational. As we move forward, there'll be other kinds of formats and other kinds of vehicles that will meet other kinds of needs. And at some point in time, we believe we'll get to the point where the vehicle can drive anywhere at any time. We're not there yet. And a few years ago, people said we'll be there in 3 to 5 years. The consensus of a vehicle that can drive anywhere at any time, meaning it can drive at night on a dirt road in a snowstorm, because you and I can do that. The consensus today in the industry, except for maybe Elon Musk, is probably 20 years. But all of these other things are much closer to getting here. Let me give you a quick example of one of those features on a project that we did last year and the year before with UTA, where we took a low-speed, electric, automated, meaning driverless shuttle, and put it at 8 different places around the state and had people ride it. Now, we had a person in there who could take over if they needed to, and they often did, but there's no steering wheel, there's no airbags, there's no rear view mirrors, because it's a vehicle that drives itself on a pre-planned, very fixed, very static course, right? In a specific location. We had 6,900 people, members of the public in Utah, ride this. 98% said they felt safe riding it, including some who rode it when we simulated the fact that the backup operator was disguised to not be a backup operator. So they thought they were in there with the vehicle without a backup operator. Compare that to the fact that 74% of the public today says, I won't get in an automated vehicle because I don't trust them. Experience develops trust. And some of those people have never seen one, never been in one, yet they have those features on their car. Connected vehicles, to close here. The concept of vehicles exchanging information, telling things to the car or the driver that the car can't see, essentially telling things that are out of view. Car three vehicles ahead of me is slamming on their brakes. Somebody around the corner that I can't see is going to run a red light, and warning the driver or the vehicle to avoid those sorts of hazards, to make driving safer. Very different paradigm. Never in history has a Toyota made a decision based on information that's sent by a Ford, but that's where we're going, or from our traffic signal. So it's an interesting paradigm. Let me give you a quick example of that. A simplistic example, but a first step towards many. UVX line. I rode that this morning from the Front Runner Station to get here. The bus rapid transit line that runs from the Orem Front Runner Station up past this campus, past BYU into downtown Provo. We've outfitted those 25 buses and the 47 signalized intersections along the route with specialized wireless communication that allows these vehicles to talk to each other. When the bus is behind schedule, it can say to the signal, hey, I'm behind schedule. Can you give me a little extra green time? And the signal, when it can, does that. Wouldn't you like that in your car? I've got a suitcase I can put in the back of my car that does that. And we've demonstrated on this corridor and on the Redwood Road corridor in Salt Lake that this works. It helps the buses get back and stay back on schedule. And we're about to expand this into a number of other corridors in Salt Lake and Utah County. A simple example of connected vehicles, not necessarily safety related, but a beginning of an expansion where we use this technology for all kinds of purposes. We've been building roads and cars to drive on them for 100 years, 110 years. And we've made a lot of advancements. Some of them stuck and some of them didn't. But we're moving forward with some new advancements. They're exciting, they're challenging, they're changing daily. We're trying to grab onto this ride and stay with it. And hopefully you'll come along with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Blaine. Great presentation. As I always believe that a solution is not always to build new roads, but to look for technology solutions, look for public transportation solutions. So our next presenter is Hal Johnson with UTA.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here with you today. I always hate presenting after Blaine. I'd rather go before Blaine, because I always feel like a downer after Blaine's done his presentation. So I did want to build on a couple points that Blaine mentioned. We are very fortunate in Utah. We have a very collaborative environment that we work with in transportation. And I've been with UTA this is my 26th year at UTA. Started when I was about 10 working there. So I've been there for a long time. And one thing that when I came into the business and started working at UTA is it was very collaborative. And we were trying to work with UDOT and working with the MPOs and trying to build those bridges. And the people that were there had done a great job in kind of helping bridge those gaps and build collaboration. And that's part of what I've tried to do through my career is help support that and help continue that dialogue that happens with UTA and UDOT and the MPOs, as well as the cities, so that we're working in partnership because we all get paid by the same folks. And so I did want to just mention that. So a couple weeks ago, I had a small medical procedure and was there at the doctor, at the anesthesiologist, and he was sticking a needle in my arm and was asking me what I did for a living. So I was telling him, he's like, oh, I always wondered why and how roads and transit got put where they got put. And so I was like, oh, okay, well, this is kind of interesting. So I'm going to talk a little bit in my presentation about kind of project development. And so this is kind of a general presentation about why we develop transit projects, but most of the same rationale applies for roadway projects as well as point projects. And talk a little bit about kind of why we build the projects. They have a purpose, and the process that we go through to do that. And so generally why we're building projects is, building them for problems today as well as problems we're forecasting in the future. We want to support the plans and aspirations of our local government partners, what cities want to achieve. And we want to also meet future mobility demands to make sure that, we all came into a transportation system that was a great system. We want to hand off a great system to the next generation, as well as be able to influence land use change. So be able to see a positive relationship between where transportation infrastructure goes in as well as where buildings are built. And then kind of what ties that all together is the regional transportation plans. So we're fortunate in the state of Utah is we have a statewide unified transportation plan that's adopted for all the metropolitan planning organizations along in the state of Utah. And the metropolitan planning organizations are the represent local government partners, and they're the agencies that help develop regional transportation plans. So they're mandated by the federal government to exist, but they've filled a really important role in the transportation community infrastructure, and that they develop plans so that you don't have disconnected roadways at a regional level. So we're very fortunate with a statewide transportation plan. And then Wasatch Front and Mountainland's association government here, they each have their own individual transportation plans for their region. And UTA, we work with both of the MPOs. And so kind of where it goes from developing a project, the first step is to be in the regional transportation plan. And so if it's not in the plan, generally it's not going to happen as a project. And so, all the time when people talk with me like, oh, I think we should have a light rail line that goes from here to there, or a project that does this. It's like, well, it's got to be in the regional transportation plan. And there's a lot that goes into getting projects into the regional transportation plan. And Shaun and Ted will probably touch on that a little bit more. So I'm going to pick up the story with a project being in the regional transportation plan. And so for us, the next step we would typically do a feasibility study. And the feasibility study would be a relatively low-cost study to really understand the markets and understand the purpose of a project. And generally, transit and roads would go through that same kind of a process where you do a low-cost study that says, yeah, there's a market here, there's a need here, there's a demand here. And then as you go through that, you would next do an alternatives analysis, a study that has a little bit more detail and really kind of starts to screen and say, okay, well, we've identified a market to connect from the front runner station to BYU. And so then we'd start to say, okay, well, what are the routes we would take to do that? Okay, well, we want to go on the parkway so we can connect with UVU as well. And so then we'd start to look at different routes. And then ultimately we look at the technology and say, okay, well, what's the right tool to connect these markets? Do we want to do a light rail system? Do we want to do front runner? And kind of go through that process. And then once we kind of figure out the alignment and the route, we would take that into an environmental study and go through what's called NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act. And under NEPA, we look at criteria to make sure the investment doesn't have negative impacts on the natural environment, the social environment, the physical environment. And so it's a really comprehensive process that a project goes through. Once we go through the NEPA process, then we'd actually do final design, and get operating agreements with our partners, figure out all the final funding for the project, and then we start construction. And then it's usually a 1 to 2 year period on the construction, and then open into operations. So a project that you'll see where there's a construction project going on, there's usually a decade or two of planning that's gone into that ahead of the construction that's going on. So I touched on a little bit on this, but this is something that we do and look at with these processes, is to make sure we're using the right tool and the right technology to fill that market. So if you think about, like our front runner system, it's big trains designed to move people over long distances quickly. And then we have like our light rail system, where they're medium-sized trains moving people over medium distances. And then like a streetcar system is really ideal for first last mile circulation, where we're moving people over short distances, usually large numbers of people in relatively short distances. So we look at the different technologies and the different ways we could move those folks in the most cost-effective way over a long period of time. We have to look at these numbers over a 20-year period and looking at what it's going to really cost to operate the systems. And then the bus is a really key component to tie everything together. And so and bus is a really flexible technology where we can use it for long trips, short trips, fast trips. So it's a tool that we use to fill in the gaps as well as provide mainline service for us. So generally, costing for transit projects. So if you're looking at a small or an enhanced bus project, they're in the $15 to $30 million range. Streetcar systems up to about $400 million. Light rail, commuter rail projects are a couple billion, or a few hundred million to a couple $1 billion. And then heavy rail or subway systems are in the billions of dollars. So when you start looking at, the different technologies, they all have a little bit different costs, as well as people moving capacity. So that's always the equation that we're looking at and trying to balance that. One of the keys that we have to go through, and I wasn't going to talk in this in much detail, but our partners at the Federal Transit Administration that help provide some of the funding for the project, they have really pretty rigid criteria that you have to go through to make sure your project is cost effective and it meets the needs and it serves your community. So it's a really good process and really makes you be very thoughtful about the projects you develop and make sure they're cost effective. And so just kind of wrapping up here, one of the biggest things that we struggle with is really figuring out the funding for projects. And so there's, funding versus financing. So financing is a tool to use to get money to build a project today, like bonding, but you always have to figure out the funding sources, like how are we going to pay for this investment, both the capital and the operating costs. And so there's, a lot of different funding sources that have been identified for projects. In the spirit of time, I'm going to skip through that one and just kind of touch on this. This is a quick example of a streetcar line in Tucson and how it got funded. And so there was a little bit of funding from the federal government through what was the Tiger program at the time, and then they've got some money through the Federal Transit Administration. Their MPOs gave some money for the project, and then they've got some money from the DOT, money from the cities, and we're able to put a project together. And so that's what we're seeing a lot right now with the projects that we're working on, is where they're coming together with a variety of funding sources. So it ends up not being really one funding source. And so that's where it takes a lot of time to be able to compete for these funds and put a project together. And so this is a slide I made up, and I really like this one. So if you look at kind of what it takes to get a project and develop the projects identified in the long-range plan, there's two different tracks that you have to work. So there's a technical track on the bottom where you're doing all this stuff I talked about, making sure it's in the plan, making sure you've got environmental clearance, finding the funding for it, and then the other part of it is having political buy-in to make sure you've got support from the community, make sure you've got support from the business community, from your political leaders, and being able to bring those processes together. Because if you don't have political support, if you don't have support from the community, you won't be able to move a project forward. If you don't have a good technical process and good technical sound reasoning, you won't be able to put a project together. So that's how things come forward through this planning process, is really where those intersections of politics as well as process come together, and you can get a project. So that's my presentation. Hopefully that was helpful. I wish my doctor could have heard the whole presentation before I fell asleep. So thanks for your time today.
Thank you so much, Hal, for the great presentation. It is very interesting to learn the process that every project has to go through before implementation. Our next presenter is Knowlton with WFRC.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Great to be with you. I want to first start by saying thank you to Utah Valley University for convening a really terrific transportation summit. It's a really interesting story and challenge that we all grapple with of growth. And, I think with that growth, we're seeing this story of evolution as well. And I think that the story of Utah Valley University kind of typifies that. All right, well, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about two major things. I'm going to talk about what the lesson of COVID-19 might tell us about the future of transportation. And then I'm going to riff a little bit on Blaine Leonard's 6 trends, not all of them, but what do those 6 trends mean for our communities? And how do we maximize the good and perhaps mitigate some of the things we don't like? All right, so let me jump in here. This is the older version. That's, okay, I'll go off of this version. Okay, let me posit to you that the more we can encourage a sharing economy when we think about connected and autonomous vehicles, when we think about all of the different modes of transportation, the better the outcomes will be. Sharing economy is this idea of utilizing assets and services when you need them without owning them. And Blaine talked about them in the transportation world. We already see Uber and Lyft. We see car sharing. We see bike sharing. I want to have you grapple with and think about, well, what are the preconditions by which we can encourage sharing and why that is good? So now this is similar to the key forces that, oh, and I don't have my microphone in my hand. That would help you a lot. Okay, and he was coming like, hey, are you going to use the microphone or? Because that would be good. All right. I got all excited. So automation, shared mobility, e-living, all of these details, at the end of the day, how these play out, they're going to play out as they work with human enduring values. Things like people want to save time. Things like people want to have a convenient experience. They want to save money. And ultimately, they want quality of life, although that definition varies from one person to another. So if you were thinking about how those key forces unfold, let's think about how they reflect and fit with enduring values. Yeah, this is, I apologize. There have been 3 versions of this, and this is 2 versions back, so I'm recalibrating my brain. I'm going to skip past this. All right, so I want to talk about 2 types of places that typify those key forces and how they relate to those enduring human values, okay? I think that these have a lot of applicability to Utah Valley and a lot of applicability to Utah. The first is Zoom towns. Have you heard this term? Not a person. Zoom is, right? How many of you have used Zoom? Thank you. All right. Zoom towns are the concept of, I don't need to live near anybody anymore. I can live wherever the heck I want to because I can rely on Zoom to connect me to the universe. Now, what's the risk? The risk is I still have to get into the workplace some, right? COVID is ending. There are workplaces like mine that are going to have 2 mandatory days in the office. What happens to the Zoomtown phenomenon when that happens? Connected and autonomous vehicles, okay? The idea that you can get in your car at the crack of dawn because you live really far away from your workplace, and maybe you have a nap, maybe you bill some time, maybe you put on your makeup. In other words, the time penalty of a long commute, it's not like it was before under this new force. So the Zoomtown phenomenon may just be beginning. we may be about to put a lot more force into the Zoomtown phenomenon. Now, so enduring values, you save time because you can, with those things, you might save money because you can take advantage of inexpensive land. The convenience deficit that's always been a problem for rural living is now shrunk, and quality of life is high for people that choose to live in a bucolic pastoral setting, right? It meets those enduring human values. Here is another thread. The other thread is, I'm calling them sharing economy centers. This is a totally different phenomenon. This is the idea where you have a rich stew of transportation options. You've got public transportation, you've got really good walking, bicycling, you've got really good density of Uber and Lyft services, you might have bike share, and you have that stew that's taking advantage of a rich collection of origins and destinations, key places to be. I would say downtown Provo is an example of a place poised to be a sharing economy center. Why do we care about this? We care about this because this is the place where you get a totally different phenomenon. The phenomenon is you dial up your mode of travel based on the need of the specific trip, not based on what you own or what you did with the last trip, right? So you took a car to that spot. You don't have to worry about getting back to that car. Maybe your next trip is across a campus where there's a lousy road network, so you hop on a bike share. Every trip conjures up a new mode, and that's the way you start to think about transportation. It throws out the window of the way of thinking of I'm a cyclist, or I'm a driver, or I'm a transit rider. It all goes out the window. It becomes a stew. Now I'm taking too much time, and so I may just wrap this up here in just a minute or two. But here's the thing. When you think about Zoom towns, and you think about what they mean, not just for meeting the enduring human values of individuals, you've got to think about the societal impacts. And the Zoomtown phenomenon has some big risks for us. They include people potentially traveling very long distances, which has infrastructure impacts. What does that mean for traffic? What does that mean for additional roadways? Who's going to pay for it? It has impacts for emissions. It has impacts for climate change. It has impacts for land consumption. It has impacts potentially for rural feel. Do we still have rural feel in those places? It has lots of impacts, and it has equity impacts in the sense that it's not open to everybody, right? It's open depending on the industry cluster that you participate in. So there are some impacts that we've got to deal with, externalities. Sharing economy also has some externalities, higher intensity of pollution exposure because you have a lot more activity in that area, but the per capita energy emissions is much lower. The land consumption is much lower. The greenhouse gas emissions are significantly lower. And there's some phenomenons that occur in the sharing economy center where you save a lot of money. That's why people would do it, right? This is all voluntary. The enduring human values in the sharing economy center are, I can drop a car. I don't have to own a car for each person in my household. Maybe I'll have one car for my household. Maybe I'll have no cars in my household because I can always rely on the autonomous vehicle or other options to serve that need for a car. I've heard it a lot, and I bet my UTA friends have heard it a lot, of people saying, you know, I would ride transit, but when I get to the workplace, I might have a meeting in the middle of the day that is 10 miles away. And that's why they don't ride transit to work. Shared mobility starts to solve some of these problems as we think about dialing up the mode for the needs of this specific trip. I'm going to skip all of this for the sake of time. Bam, 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 bam. It was really interesting, believe me. and just get to, this is my closing slide. So the closing slide is, if we're thinking about the sharing economy, how do we nurture that, and where in Utah Valley can we nurture that? We can nurture that on the infrastructure side by focusing on, I would put forward to you, we focus on the walk and bike. Because when it's a walkable and bikeable environment, people are more likely to enjoy that activity of living without a car. They're more like, the land development is more likely to feed into that kind of position. And so that is the soil of the ecosystem of a shared economy center, is a really walkable, bikeable place. So on the land use side, pedestrian-oriented, mixed use, relatively intense, that's the shared economy land use. The strategy for a city to get there is to deregulate. It's actually to get out of the way of land development. Let the mix happen. Get out of the way of parking. If there's less parking demand because of these phenomenons, let the marketplace innovate with parking. Don't think about parking the way we did in the 80s. Think about parking the way we might in 20 years and deregulate. And on the Zoomtown side, you know, to each their own. That's a great environment and place for people that choose Zoomtowns. The societal impacts have to be balanced. And those societal impacts include, how are we going to pay for it? Do we explore user fees for transportation more than we have been? And how do we balance rural preservation? What's the land use strategy for that? So wanted to put forward those two big ideas. When you add up all of the forces that Blaine put forward, that there's kind of two big place types that I think we're going to see emerging more and more. These are already occurring, the Zoomtowns and the Shared Economy Center. And let's wrap our heads around, how do we encourage what we want? How do we mitigate some of the downsides of the Zoomtown phenomenon that we're already seeing? Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Ted. We appreciate it. Thank you for sharing these concepts. I personally agree with you 100%, and I believe that active transportation is one of the top solutions to all these problems. Our next presentation, let me move real quick here. Shaun Seager with MAC.
Thank you very much. Thank you guys. So many great friends here today, and got to hear the president of the university speak a little bit. I've never heard her speak before. So fascinating to hear her story, where she comes from, and just found it just fascinating and really enjoyed it. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. And I'm just going to go through a thesis with you that I'm going to share, and I want you to think about this idea and then be critical of it, and then we'll talk about it at the end. And the thesis that I'm going to present today is to make all of our transit systems free to the user, because we have a very small amount of dollars going into the transit system from fare box collection. Most of the revenue comes in sales tax. And with some recent changes in technology that Blaine talked to and Ted talked to, along with some of the things that are happening in the land use world and the way that freight is being delivered, there's kind of a critical moment for transit right now. The transit's either going to need to rise up to the occasion, or I'm afraid it's going to be threatened by all this technology that we've been hearing about. So I'm going to go through a bunch of slides really fast. I'm going to skip over this stuff and go to what Mayor Brunt's talked about this morning, transit being fast, free, and frequent. This is Mayor Kaufusi, and Mayor Kaufusi and Mayor Brunt's coined this term. And it kind of stuck with our mayors and county commissioners. That's who I get to work for, is the mayors and county commissioners in Utah County. And we coordinate a transportation plan. And the key thing with Utah Valley Express, or the bus rapid transit system, being successful in Provo and Orem, was to have that thing be as fast as possible. It has some dedicated lanes to make it free, thanks to UVU and BYU's contract that we heard about this morning, $1 million each per year going into that to make that free for the students, and then to make it frequent. Every 6 to 10 minutes, that bus is arriving. So This is one of my favorite favorite interviews or press pieces that I've ever heard. I don't know if this is going to work, and if it doesn't, that's okay. I can skip on to the next one, but this is a personality that some of you may remember. Okay. All right, it did not work. That was Donald Rumsfeld, and he, we heard him in the news recently. He just passed away. He was Secretary of Defense, and he was famous for saying this phrase that there are things that we know, things we don't know, and then unknown unknowns. And we just went through one of those events called the pandemic. It's something that we did not see coming as transportation planners, transportation engineers. And a lot of the planning and projection work we do is we look back in time and we project it forward in time. We say, how many trips did we take last year on that road? Well, we're going to take the same number of trips next year on that road, only increase it just a little bit. So my thesis that transit needs to be free to the user comes from a futurist by the name of Rick Stein. So a lot of this content that I'm going to share with you real briefly comes from Rick. He's presented at the Utah League of Cities and Towns annual convention before. And he thinks about these big picture things that I can only try to think about a little bit, but he spends a lot of time thinking about it. Has three components. Rapid changes in technology, overbuilt retail environment, and then changes in freight that we've heard little pieces on today. I'll just do the technology piece real briefly. Technology changes. Blaine has illustrated some of that today, but there's a famous game called Go. It's a 2,500-year-old game. It was invented in China, and they applied a computer program to it called DeepMind's AI Alpha. And this computer program uses artificial intelligence to try to create new ways to win at the game Go. Go is a game that I would play in sacrament meeting at church when my grandfather was resting his eyes, with my sister. And so this computer program created a Move 37, is what it's called, in the artificial intelligence group that blew everyone away. They'd never thought about this before, that how could this computer program think of something that had never been considered before? So this rapid change in technology is something that we're seeing propagate throughout our community. If you look at the slant of these charts, you don't have to read it. Just look at the angle from the left side to the right side. The angle is increasing, and what that is the rate of adoption. So the very slowest rate of adoption, the telephone, started in the 1900s and had pretty much universal adoption in 1990 or so, 1980. Look at the tablet or the smartphone, how fast we picked up those devices. I used to give this presentation to student groups, and I'd use the cell phone as an example. I'd hold up my mobile telephone, and I'd say, this thing did not exist 10 years ago. I used to drive around with a paper map in my car to understand how to get places, and the students would be, what are you talking about? Paper map. They could not grasp that idea. This is the Google car, one of the first self-driving cars in 2009. It looks like one of those little cars that I used to push my children around in. It had a handle on it, and we would go for an automobile ride. So that's where our self-driving cars started out. This is the Google car, now called Waymo, in Chandler, Arizona. I've ridden in this van, and it's driverless. The driver is actually in the passenger seat, and then the paying customers sit in the back. This is in 2017 in Chandler. This is the new Waymo that's been purchased by Google. It's a Jaguar I-Pace all-electric car. They've ordered 20,000 units of these. The only problem with this car is the acceleration rate is so fast that they had to turn that down so they didn't intimidate the customers. So rapid technology change is what I'm trying to get at here. I won't go through too much more detail on this, but this technology change could be a real threat to transit because it's going to be lower cost, provide more frequent service, and deliver you door to door. We've heard about this a little bit today. Software as a service, mobility as a service. In the old days, I would go buy a new version of Windows in the box or a new version of Microsoft Office. and it was in a nice box, and it looked like a book or something. You take the disc out and you put it into your computer and you enter in that 20-digit horrible code, with upper and lowercase letters. And I'd put the disc back into the box and I'd put it on the shelf, and I'd never touch that box again. It was a product. I thought I was buying a product. I wasn't buying a product, I was buying a service. Now my entire office subscribes to a software service. We don't go to Best Buy anymore and buy a new version of Windows or a new version of Microsoft Office. We subscribe to it, so it's become a service. The same thing is happening with mobility, as Blaine mentioned. Right now, to own a car, it's about 55 cents a mile, or 58 cents a mile, I think is what IRS allows you to write off. It costs about 15 cents a mile for an Uber ride. So costs are dramatically lower in this new environment. This is me with my 1969 Chevy Camaro when I was 16 years old. I don't know why my shirt is off, and I don't know why I'm touching the mirror with my finger. But apparently that was pretty cool, to me. How was I thinking about that? Was I thinking about that car as a service or a product? I was thinking about that as my identity. That was a piece of me. That's how I thought about myself. And now we're switching the way that we're thinking about transportation, and we're thinking about ways to get around. As Blaine mentioned today, he rode Frontrunner down, and then he took UVX over here, and he'll probably do something similar when he starts his trip back home. This is very interesting data, and please tell me how we're doing on time, and I'll wrap it up as soon as you want me to. Okay, sounds good. This is origin and destination data. This is available from WFRC's website or MAG's website. This is looking at, for all the trips that are coming to Orem, for Orem, where people work in Orem live. So people that are working in Orem, where do they live? We can actually see now with our data where they're coming from to the city of Orem. We could plan our transit route that way. This data is available today from our website. This is UDOT's mobility dashboard. I took a screenshot of this yesterday. The data is from July 6. So it's a 10 days old. This shows the most congested routes in Utah County on July 6. The top one up there happens to be 2100 North and that 2300 West area in Lehigh that's very difficult to get out of the Thanksgiving Point area. University Parkway happens to be on here. I believe it's number 8 or so. This data is real-time data. We used to have to wait 3 years to get this data. This is UTA's ridership dashboard. I can actually see the ridership of UTA 2 weeks ago and what it's doing. I can select different routes. The information we have available to us is unprecedented. By the way, UTA's ridership is still at about less than 50% of what they were before COVID. Our transit ridership is way down. Our travel on the UDOT roads is about 100%. We're about where we were just before the pandemic. So I'm going to save you the rest of the slides and just draw this financial detail to your attention. If you were to add UTA's budget with UDOT's budget, it's about $2 billion per year. So keep it really simple. UTA's budget is about $500 million. UDOT's budget's about $1.5 billion. So a quarter of our revenue is going to transit. 3/4 of our revenue is going to roadway construction and maintenance and operation. About 1% of our trips are taking place on transit. About 76% of our trips are taking place on the roadway in single occupied vehicles. So an easy way to double our transit ridership and make that increase is to make it a free service. Get people on the bus, just like UVX, fast, free, and frequent. And that's something that we've been talking about as a policy lever that we could use in the future. It's only about $40 million per year is what we think, because there's a cost for collection So we have some really interesting ways to think about this, and love to hear your questions and thoughts afterwards. And I'll wrap up now and save the rest of the slides for later. And hopefully we can have a couple good questions and conversations about it. Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shaun. I even forgot to look at the time. The presentation was very exciting. We have time for a few questions. Can you repeat the question, please, because we have people online?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
The transportation fast, free, and frequent, how would that impact the cost if you're making it free while increasing the frequency?
So, is it working? Okay, great. How will it increase the cost? This is one of the concerns that UTA has had, and as Mary mentioned, we're fortunate today to have Trustee Acerson. I refer to him as Mayor Acerson because he's one of my mayors, but he's also a trustee. So he's kind of doing double duty up there. One of the concerns that UTA has is if we reduce the fare, if we just let everyone ride for free, we're going to get so much demand. Our buses are going to be full. Our trains are going to be full. We're going to have to hire more drivers. My response is fantastic. What a great problem to have for our transit system. Meaning, I think if we are successful in getting people on the train, on the bus, that the revenue will be there. So does that answer your question, I hope?
If it's free, where is the revenue coming from?
Oh, thank you. The revenue replacement for that would come from even someone like UDOT. As we heard earlier today, UDOT put $300 million, or the state legislature put $300 million into UTA to make Frontrunner faster. So we have this partnership that's beginning to blossom and develop between the Utah Department of Transportation and UTA. And as Blaine mentioned, and also Ted, cooperation and coordination is something that Utah is very proud about. It's our little secret sauce. It's our fry sauce, if you will. The sum is greater than the parts that are in it when we collaborate. And so we're not talking about reducing the revenue, we're talking about revenue replacement. And that would come from maybe some grants from the local governments or from the state.
Great, thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah, let me ask a real quick question. My name's Steve from UVU. Just kind of curious, when you look at a multimodal transportation system design plan, is any of your plans inclusive of aviation and the future of urban air mobility type concepts?
Great question. UDOT does have an aviation division, as you're well aware, and they do some aviation planning. And they do that for the entire state of Utah. And so they do some coordination work with the MPOs, with the metropolitan areas. Obviously, all the airports have direct connections to UDOT, and they actually receive some federal funds through UDOT for aviation improvements. Blaine, do you want to discuss that at all, or does that cover that?
That's out of my wheelhouse.
Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Jared Esselman's the primary point of contact, right? Okay, thanks.
I have a question for UTA. So basically, we learned a lot today about all these new initiatives for new construction. And I wanted to know, what are we currently doing as far as promoting existing service? Is there any initiatives that basically are related to promote and encourage more people to use the public transportation?
I can say something if you want to. So I guess with respect to kind of how we promote public transportation, we do you'll see UTA ads that provide a overall kind of image of UTA and kind of advertising UTA as a we're out here, come ride. And so that's kind of at the base level. And then we do a lot of work that's kind of door to door and hand to hand, where we're working with businesses to do our EcoPass program and get businesses involved and be able to provide low cost or free passes to employees. So that's one of probably the biggest initiatives we do. You don't always see that, but that's really what we focused a lot of our efforts on, is kind of first promoting the overall image and the brand and making people aware of transit, and then really kind of, like we have pass programs with UVU and BYU, and all the schools are on our pass programs, as well as state of Utah. I think they're on our pass program, and so we really promote the pass program to be able to get free passes are out there for people to use it. So that's probably a big part of our efforts. And then like a lot of times we'll do specific route campaigns. So we can mail out direct flyers to routes. So I've done a couple of those for projects I've worked on, where we'll send out. We sent out for a line I did in West Valley. We sent out probably 10,000 passes to people, and we got a really good return. So it was a direct mail thing. We got 20% return, where 20% of the passes got cashed in. Great. So which was really high for direct mail returns. So we've done those kinds of things as well. And then I've seen, just kind of general promotion flyers UTA will sometimes run for routes and services. So I think coming out of the COVID period, we're still figuring out how to rewrite the book on transit. So great.
Mention a couple other things we're doing is ticket as fare. So it's going to be a new promotion we're going to be starting with. We've had financial commitments with, like University of Utah might have a event, and we would let people who had a ticket to that event use it for fare. And in the past, they've paid us for that. But now we're saying, well, to get ridership back, we're going to give that for free as long as you promote UTA. Put UTA's logo on your tickets and advertise UTA's ridership. So that's one thing that we're going to be starting soon. And then also with our VIA microtransit program, we're going to have a lot of initiatives. We're trying to start with that as well, of, like refer a friend and you get a free ride or things like that. So those are two things that are going to be coming up soon.
Oh, great. I have one more question for Blaine. So we learned today about these great initiatives when it comes to connected vehicles and autonomous vehicles. So what is really the most challenging thing now that UDOT has to go through in the process of implementation?
Well, where do I start? This wireless communication system is regulated by the FCC. And the FCC has different ideas than we do. And so one of the big challenges we've had in the last 5 years is navigating the changes that the FCC throws at us. Secondly, ultimately, although today we're communicating with snowplows that we own and buses that UTA owns, and pretty soon some other vehicles that agencies own, ultimately our plan here is to be able to communicate with the Ford and the Toyota and the General Motors vehicle that you buy at the local dealership. What we've discovered over the last 10 or 12 years is, for 100 years we've been building roads and they've been building cars, and we've never talked to them. They know how wide our lanes are, and they know that the driver in the car can read our signs, and we've never had to communicate with the automakers. Well, now that we're talking about sharing data between our traffic signal and their vehicle, and the Society of Automotive Engineers has developed a standard around how we do that communication, we've discovered as we talk to the automakers that they have very different viewpoints on how and when that's used than we do. They have a different business model. They have a different outlook. They have a different sort of motivation for living, right? I mean, they're a profit-making organization and we're a government agency, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Our paradigms are very different. And where 6 years, 7 years ago, when we started down this path, we thought we were pretty close to having this technology communication work well. Today we're finding that we're not that close. And we're in very detailed, very regular conversations with automakers and still learning about, you mean you want us to do what? And so that's been very complicated as we bridge this gap that we didn't know existed. Talk about Donald Rumsfeld's unknown unknowns. To try to move the technology in a way that they can trust it and we can trust it and we can meet their needs, and vice versa. So those are probably two things. I'll bring up a third one just really quickly. As anyone knows who's working in sort of the tech-related industry, the technology moves quickly. So just when we figure something out, something changes. And that's happening to us right now as we're changing technology platforms a little bit. And so it's just a rapidly moving target. And we're moving as quickly as we can and being as aggressive as we can, but some days I feel like I'm chasing a rabbit down the road.
Thank you so much. One last question to Ted. So actually, we learned today about new concepts, Zoom towns, and it seems like it depends mainly on promoting active transportation. What do you think about how to do that, or how to achieve that, how to encourage more people to cycle and walk in these towns?
Utahns want to bicycle. The surveys we've done, you ask people, do you wish you were out there bicycling more? And people say, yeah. I think it's 40% of Utahns say, I want to bike more. So why don't they? I don't think it's an ad campaign. I think it's a safety issue. It's a simple question of, what are the routes that you would let your 12-year-old child go on, right? Or what are the routes that if you are an occasional bicyclist, you would feel like, yeah, I'm safe doing that and getting to that destination. So if bicycling is recreational, it's never going to flourish. If bicycle gets us to the destinations we need to get to, it will flourish. And to do that, it has to be highly safe. If it's not a highly safe network, it will never flourish. But every time it's a highly safe network globally, it does flourish. Doesn't matter if the climate is like ours. Okay, big misconception about Utah.
I was just going to add too, UTA has been working for the past 2 years on a federally funded by grant project called our First Mile, Last Mile projects. And that is ways to get people safely to our transit stations, either via walking or via biking. And it's putting in bridges, it's putting in trails, it's putting in safe connections. So hopefully
Excellent.
that promotes it as well.
Absolutely. Yep.
Along with that question, in the mayor's panel this morning, Governor Herbert and some of the other mayors talked a lot about the infrastructure that's necessary to sustain Utah's economic growth and to provide access for these jobs. And this was not a universal attitude, but it was clear from Governor Herbert and some of the other mayors that they viewed that as expressways and high-capacity roadway systems. It's from what we understand, that kind of system will prevent the adoption of bicycling and serious transit as a mode. You're shaking your head, Shaun. But my question was, how much do the priorities of high-level decision makers provide an impediment to adopting these active transportation or transit-oriented policies that I think we in this community and you on this panel have said we need?
Now, I'll approach your question in two different ways. Answer your last question first, which is, how have elected officials embraced or not embraced bicycle pedestrian projects? And Ted and I often visit about this topic, and this is how the conversation often goes. That we're putting $1.5 billion into UDOT. We're putting $500 million into UTA. What are we putting into bike ped? Almost nothing when you compare it to those big numbers, even with the Tiger grant that Mary just referenced at $20 million. It's nothing compared to $500 million or $1.5 billion. So I think you're spot on there. that the allocation of revenue has not kept up with the interest in bicycle and pedestrian activities. But I don't think they're exclusive from one another. So I think you can build high-speed, high-capacity facilities and, in the right location, also build bicycle pedestrian facilities. I understand you don't want to build those right on top of each other or in that same corridor oftentimes. My boss often uses this analogy that he went and asked his father-in-law for a saw to cut some wood. And his father-in-law is a woodworker guy and has a shed full of tools. And his father-in-law says, what kind of sawing are you going to do? He says, I just need to saw some wood. And he's like, well, do you need a chainsaw or a hacksaw or a table saw or a miter saw? He's like, tell me what you're trying to do with this wood that you're going to cut. And we often use this analogy that in Provo and Orem, for example, we've built all the freeways we're going to build in Provo and Orem. We can't build any more high capacity roadways or freeways in Provo and Orem, but we're going to invest heavily in transit in Provo and Orem. Out in Eagle Mountain, what they need right now is a bunch of high-speed, high-capacity roadways to be constructed, freeways to be built out in that area. Then when they get to be about 300,000, 400,000 people, we're going to start building big transit facilities out in Saratoga Springs and Eagle Mountain. So you see this evolution of an urban area from initial automobile access to maturing up and kind of building out. And so that's the way that I view that.
I would just say, for my 2 cents, I think coming back to in my presentation, talked about having a long-range plan, and right now, bicycle ped has moved a long ways in the last 10 years, where it wasn't even in the plan, and now it's in the plan, and there's discussion, there's active focus on it, and so I would say it's initially a lot of bike ped infrastructure happened through what I call heroic efforts, where there was like the Jordan River Trail. If you look at the history of how the Jordan River Trail got built, it was, piece by piece, heroic effort by heroic effort, put that together. And whereas you look at, UDOT builds a new I-15 project, it's not really a heroic effort that's going on. It's more of a systems approach. And I think bike ped's starting to evolve that way, where it's more of a systems approach, and it's more systematic. At least it's in the plan now. It doesn't have the dedicated funding towards it, but there is recognition of it. And so I think it will continue to evolve. But I guess the point I would make is, get it in the plan, and then it can evolve from there.
And I just want to I know we're running out of time. I love the question. I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic that I think we're in the lag period. I think that the level of support for active transportation is actually really high. It's really high in city by city. It's really high in the broad populace. I think it's growing in support at the state level. We have a state DOT that is really supportive of active transportation. We have funding that is not aligned with support for active transportation. Shaun talked about that. But those things can change, and I think they will change. And part of the way that they can change is if people see that there are links between these kinds of mode decisions and the core problems that Utah faces. And one of them is affordability. So everybody's hands are rightfully ringing about housing affordability in Utah, and the cost of transportation for household to household is among the highest in the world. That's part of our affordability problem. But if we don't start to think of, something as mundane as bicycling as a legitimate form of transportation, then we can't bring that down. We have to start to see these things as relating to each other. And I would also even say on the economic development front, when we're trying to attract skilled labor, they're looking for communities where there's a very high level of amenity, and it's not just parks. It's also bicycle systems, and it's never been more important for bicycling to be part of community amenity now that COVID-19 has caused an explosion.